What the fuck?
Peronism is an Argentine political movement named for and founded by Juan Domingo Perón, the president of Argentina from 1946 to 1955, and again from 1973 until his death the next year in 1974. Since then, there's been many more politicians, including 3 presidents, who've called themselves Peronists, and is today the single most popular political identification in the country. And yet it's still really hard to pin down and define in a way that includes all or even most Peronists. You might think that you can take a look at some Peronist politicians and identify some common policies, but there's really not much there at all. There's more than a dozen significant Peronist parties, and Peronists often end up competing against other, very different Peronists. There was even a presidential election where the 2 main candidates were both Peronists. So that makes no sense. Well, what about Perón himself? Surely his politics define Peronism, right? Well, not only did Perón himself change a lot over his 30-odd years as a prominent political figure, but Peronism is very much a living, breathing movement. It's changed a lot in the 45 years since Perón's death, as you would expect of any political movement or ideology, except conservatism. So it would be a mistake to define Peronism solely by looking at Perón. So why don't we ask some Argentines about it then? Surely they'll be able to explain, right? I mean, it's their country. Well, I've tried that many times. When I first came here, it was actually my go-to conversation starter.
Hey, baby. Explícame lo que es el peronismo ahorita.
The most common answer that I got was nervous laughter, followed by them saying that they just had no idea how to answer that question. That or an attempt at answering that would end very inconclusively. The next most common was an immediate, very confident response, but with very little consistency. Peronism is socialism, Peronism is communism, Peronism is fascism, Peronism is when the government does stuff. That sort of thing. Generally, that comes more from people who don't particularly like Peronism very much, who seem to just be trying to brand it with adjectives that they consider to be negative. So how can so many Argentines, including Peronists themselves, find it so difficult to explain Peronism or give such varied answers as to what they think it is? Well, it's because it's something more cultural that's maybe understood a bit more subconsciously. Something that's deeply rooted in the Argentine national identity itself, and post-colonial politics in general. So we're going to have to look at the development of the Argentine post-colonial identity and the history of Peronism together. So let's go back in time just a little bit. Okay, actually a lot. Argentina, like much of the Americas, was for centuries a Spanish colony with a very rigid caste system. On the top, you had Spanish-born people, followed by Spanish descendants born in the colonies, other Europeans, mixed-race people, indigenous people, and finally, African slaves. After independence, this situation barely changed. At best, the dominance of Spanish loyalist families was replaced with the dominance of rich, Argentine-born, Spanish-descended families. So land ownership and wealth became highly concentrated in the hands of those at the top of the pyramid, with huge portions of it owned by the same few dozen families for hundreds of years. This also resulted, if it wasn't there already, in a strong sense of cultural superiority among the rich, land-owning, European-descended elites, who tried their best to impose this culture on everyone else. This is quite a bit different to what happened in some other non-Spanish colonies, especially British ones. For instance, in Australia, after the British robbed Indigenous people of their land, there were many ways for settler colonial immigrants to acquire parts of this land. And while there was still plenty of discrimination, it resulted in far more social mobility and relatively fewer cultural distinctions between people of different social classes. An Australian settler identity was therefore allowed to develop, which eventually displaced the British identity, even among the elite. The question of land doomed Argentina to a very different fate. Yet still, a culture of the masses did develop. From the 19th century onwards, following Argentina's independence in 1818, slavery was abolished. They received an absolutely ridiculous amount of poor European immigrants in the hope that they would become cheap and abundant labor for the governing landowners, in stark contrast to the ideal of the American dream or the independent farming lifestyles that were promoted in other colonies or former colonies. And they also genocided a whole lot of indigenous people, as colonists tend to love to do. The result of the mingling of these different groups of lower class people was a mishmash of poor European, African, and indigenous culture. And yes, there were actually a lot of Africans in Argentina. About 30% of the population of Buenos Aires was black at the beginning of the 19th century. There's far fewer now as Argentina went on to receive many white immigrants and almost no black ones, but still, black Argentines played a role in the development of Argentina, and they still do today, important to acknowledge. The rich, powerful, and politically influential rejected this developing identity entirely. As a result, it was marginalized despite its prevalence. It was considered lowbrow, barbaric, and nothing to be proud of. So Argentina was a country where the majority were not only completely economically and socially marginalized, but also culturally marginalized. And thus began the Argentine inferiority complex. The Martinique post-colonial philosopher, Frantz Fanon, wrote of an internalized inferiority complex in colonized peoples. For him, the colonized are first subject to economic domination, and then the colonizers subsequently impose their supposedly superior culture on the colonized. Thus, eventually colonized peoples would come to believe themselves to be inferior through this dual economic and cultural domination. Something very similar manifested in Argentina. Now, Argentines, in their majority, are mostly settlers themselves, and thus not victims of colonialism, but they were and still are victims of neo-colonialism. That is, indirect domination by informal empires, such as being subject to the economic, political, and cultural whims of the British Empire and later the United States. And since the aforementioned local elites eschewed the local culture to instead look elsewhere, and stood to benefit a whole lot from open trade with these informal empires, they were very happy to cooperate. But in the early 20th century, a spanner was thrown into the works of this status quo. Tango, and more specifically, Carlos Gardel, the legendary tango singer-songwriter who fast rose to international superstardom in the 1920s. It might sound absurd at first glance, but Gardel played an irreplaceably crucial role in making an authentic Argentine cultural production, something that the majority could openly and enthusiastically take pride in and that the elite could not simply dismiss. In the early 20th century, tango was about as authentic of an Argentine cultural product as you could possibly get. Uruguay no me importa, es una provincia. Influenced by the music of poor European immigrants, freed African slaves, and indigenous peoples, it was the music of the majority, of the fast-growing urban working class that did all of the dirty, dangerous, and poorly paid work, before going out and dancing tango in the night while the band played with whatever instruments happened to be on hand. And once it evolved into a lyrical genre after 1917, this was reflected in its themes, with lyrics frequently dealing with the misery of poverty. So, as you might expect, at first the local elite didn't take very kindly to it. Yet Gardel, who was raised in Buenos Aires by a poor immigrant single mother in communal housing, was unapologetic about his roots and sang songs full of the slang of the city's poor. And you know what? He went from singing on the streets with his friends, to singing in clubs, to national fame, and then to selling records in Europe, to the point that he ended up touring cities like Paris and Milan himself, and the French even started making their own crappy knockoff tangos. So of course, once it became a thing in Europe, the elite was suddenly all over tango as if they'd loved it all along. Oh then, well if it's all the rage in Paris, then we love it too. Actually, we were on board from the start. This lent power to an authentic cultural expression of the Argentine majority for the very first time, and did a lot to clear the way for a potential political movement based around working class identity. Hipólito Yrigoyen, president from 1916 to 1920, and again from 1928 to 1930, also helped to set the stage for this. Argentine governance had previously been dominated entirely by a cartel of reactionaries, and Yrigoyen was one of the key figures in getting them to implement universal male suffrage, and this directly led to him being elected in a landslide 4 years later. He was a liberal, and as liberals do, he ran governments that were legitimized primarily through their popularity among the middle class rather than the working class. Luckily for him, this was a winning strategy at the time, because huge portions, around 50%, of the working class just had no political rights, because they were immigrants without citizenship who could not vote. Nonetheless, Yrigoyen was still Argentina's first truly elected leader, and he was definitely far better than anyone that had come before him, so the traditional oligarchy hated him all the same. Shortly though, the children of those working class immigrants, who would be Argentine citizens from birth, would grow up and be able to vote, giving the working class majority the potential to drive a political movement for the very first time. And Juan Domingo Peron burst onto the national political stage at just the right moment to take full advantage. Peron was a military officer who had visited Europe on observational assignment in the late 1930s. He returned to Argentina with newfound political ambitions and what was a fairly unique idea at the time, to take what he called a social democratic project based on what he saw in Europe, including in fascist Italy. Yeah. and apply it to the unique circumstances of Argentina, a post-colonial nation where the majority had never been politically represented in any capacity. In doing so, he believed that he could create a third way between laissez-faire capitalism, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and communism.
Los hombres honrados de todos los pueblos se suman a nuestra tercera posición.
Free from the long-running political, economic, and socio-cultural dominance of the so-called First World, especially the UK and the USA. After participating in a military coup in 1943, Perón was handed a previously quite powerless position in the Ministry of Labour in the new government. But he leveraged this in a way that no one had thought possible, by quickly allying himself with the General Confederation of Workers, one of the most important confederations of trade unions in the country. The CGT was uniquely suited to his project, as it had very recently undergone a split with its socialist and communist factions. So the leadership that remained were not radicals, and they were very open to trying Perón's third way. Just 2 years later, the CGT had greatly expanded its membership and become unflinchingly loyal to Perón. This was the first time ever that a political figure in Argentina had drawn most of their support from the working class majority. An attempt by the military dictatorship to curb his growing power by arresting him nearly resulted in a popular uprising on October 17, 1945. They were quickly forced to release him to keep the peace. And it's no surprise that he became so popular so fast, because while he's often deridingly called a populist, the fact is that he was saying things that, while very fiery,
Luchamos y vencemos para consolidar las conquistas alcanzadas o la oligarquía la va a destrozar a España.
were also very, very true. Argentina was a very rich country in terms of gross GDP, being in the top 10 in the world, though it had been on a bit of a decline since the 1930s. But that wealth simply wasn't translating into development nor reaching most people. At the time, Argentina was easily one of the most unequal countries in the world. There really were extremely powerful and influential oligarchs who held much of the country's wealth. In the early 1940s, 25% of gross GDP was going to the richest 1%. For some context, that's far worse than even the USA during the Great Depression. He also correctly identified the economic dominance of foreign powers. For example, in the 1940s, more than 60% of the country's railways were owned by British companies, and the USA was doing everything that it could to promote its self-benefiting free market ideology in Argentina, to the extent that the US ambassador even wrote a book denouncing Perón and had shouting matches with him in public. But Perón's message was not just one of exploitation, not just one of blame. It was also very positive. Not in the value judgment sense, but in the sense that it believed in people. Perón said that Argentine workers were capable, that they were strong, that their culture was valid, that united they could make Argentina better for themselves. Contrast this with the very negative message offered to Argentina by the so-called First World and its associated local oligarchy. Essentially that normal people are a rabble who don't know what's best for themselves and that they need the guidance of the enlightened, who just so happen to be those same foreign powers and those same local oligarchs. You can see this contrast more clearly in the way that Perón and his lover and later wife, Evita, fully embraced the working class Argentine identity. They took slurs that had previously been used against workers, such as descamisados or shirtless ones in English, and helped to turn them into positive labels that they could take pride in. This was not just the work of the Peróns though. It was made possible by the legitimization of the working class Argentine identity that had occurred over the previous decades. So Perón himself was no liberator. Rather, he took advantage of the mainstreaming of Argentina's mix and match culture that had been enabled by figures like Gardel and the political rights that workers had won under Irigoyen. Workers had finally rejected the inferiority complex, finally had political rights, and were ready to fully participate and further their own interests. And Perón was really just in the right place at the right time and saying the right things. And speaking of Evita, don't cry for me, Argentina. Yeah, I tried. She did a whole lot for Peronism herself. In late 1945, she emerged as an incredibly skilled politician in her own right and rapidly became incredibly popular, especially among women who still could not legally vote. Within months of bursting onto the scene, she was already doing things that were previously unheard of in Argentine politics, such as holding women-only political rallies attended by tens of thousands. So it was not just working-class men who emerged onto the political scene under Peron, but women too. So by now I'm sure you've caught onto the vibe here that Juan Peron was a bit of an opportunist who was taking advantage of the growing class consciousness among workers. And Evita's co-leadership, regardless of whether it was just a coincidence or planned, was incredibly convenient for him. Thanks to her, he was assured the vote of most women, which was a big part of the reason that he ended up giving them a vote. Unsurprisingly, more women voted in the 1951 election than men, most of them for Peron, who was re-elected in a landslide. Additionally, while Peron did greatly improve workers' rights and conditions, his interest in their liberation was confined to the unions that supported him. That is, the unions that dominated the formal industrial sector. Essentially, Peron wanted to ensure that he was getting something out of the deal too, as he was trying to build up local industry, which needed workers, obviously. He also sought the support of the local industrial bourgeoisie, who were generally not part of the traditional agriculture-focused oligarchy. This was all part of his bigger plan to promote import substitution industrialization, the local manufacture of goods to replace imports, with the vision of eventually making Argentina self-sufficient. Anarchist, socialist, and communist unions that embraced informal workers couldn't compete, because Peron's new social welfare policies were only available to workers in formal employment, which was dominated by the urban industrial sector, where the Peronist unions were strongest. Thus, workers were coerced into formal labor, which brought them into the Peronist unions, and ensured Peron their support. This strategy was incredibly effective. In 1945, his CGT union had a membership of 500,000. Just 6 years later, this had risen to more than 3 million. That's enough votes that even if only CGT members had voted for Peron in the 1951 general election, he still would have won. Peron also supported women's workplace participation for similar reasons. Getting them into the formal labour sector meant that he was further assured their votes. That might make him seem like a bit of a feminist, but don't be fooled, he was still very much a social conservative. He was in conflict with the Catholic Church, but this was mostly because it was an incredibly powerful institution with a lot of political power, leaned highly reactionary, and very much did not approve of Peron and his attempts to separate church from state, which clearly failed as the Argentine state still funds the Catholic Church today. Nonetheless, Peron branded himself as a Catholic conservative and promoted the same traditional family values and gender roles as the church, showing that his interest in women's liberation wasn't exactly genuine. Still, he and Evita's actions definitely made things much better for women in Argentina than they had ever been, so he did do good things, even if for selfish reasons. With that in mind, Peron was definitely a right-winger, despite drawing support from elements of both the left and the right. He emerged at a time before the right was associated with free market capitalist ideology. Through his political maneuvering, he delegitimized the left, offering workers an alternative that, while better than what they had before, stopped well before complete liberation and had very clear limits that benefited himself. He also greatly appealed to much of the right wing, such as domestic industrialists who had a lot to gain from Peron's protectionism. Now I just want to take a second here to address the elephant in the room. Yes, Peron really liked fascism. Peron had spent a short time on assignment in Italy in the late 1930s, where he was sheltered and quite disconnected from the actual reality of fascism. He came back to Argentina with a very idealized view of fascist Italy. When you read his own words about it though, it's clear that he very badly misunderstood what fascism actually was. He wrote that fascism was a formula that gave the people active participation, a true social democracy. So his own description of fascism doesn't actually sound like fascism at all, does it? And that's because he just completely misinterpreted it. And his political project in Argentina was partly based on his misinterpretation rather than actual fascism. Federicho Finchelstein, an Argentine historian who is an expert on both fascism in Argentina and Europe, says that, for the vast majority of historians, movements like Peronism that were influenced by fascism are not necessarily fascists themselves. Generally, the people who like to say otherwise are a lot more concerned with delegitimizing a working class movement than they are with honestly assessing whether or not Peron really did fascism. So Peron, definitely a problematic dude, but not a fascist. And that should really be self-evident just by looking at the stuff that he actually did, which wasn't very fascist in the slightest. Unless you define fascism as thing that I don't like, in which case it may look like fascism to you. Okay, let's move on now. There were two coup attempts against Peron in 1955. The first, on June 16th, was carried out by reactionary elements of the military aligned with the Catholic Church and the traditional oligarchy. Planes from the Navy literally bombed the Plaza de Mayo, the city center of Buenos Aires, in the middle of the day. They killed hundreds of civilians before units loyal to Peron put the coup down. Just a few months later though, in September, he was finally ousted by another military coup supported by those same interests and was forced into exile for nearly 20 years. Despite that, Peronism, even without Peron, remained so incredibly popular that it had to be banned to prevent its resurgence. Peronist parties were finally unbanned for the 1973 election, and a surrogate Peronist president, Héctor Cámpara, won in a landslide following years of turbulence and dictatorships. Perón won another election later that year in another landslide and finally returned, taking up the presidency himself. He immediately took a sharp turn much further to the right, explicitly denouncing some of the most important left-wing Peronist factions. He then started an anti-leftist state terror campaign. This campaign, which was already heinous, became even worse after his death in 1974, and much worse still from 1976 to 1983 under the subsequent genocidal right-wing military dictatorship, which justified its seizure of power from the previous Peronist government by saying that it wasn't murdering the leftists efficiently enough. In the time between the return to liberal democracy in 1983 and Perón's exile in 1955, Argentina had been ruled by a mix of civilian and military governments that had favoured more liberal capitalist economics, including the aforementioned military dictatorship that murdered tens of thousands of people to implement neoliberalism at the barrel of a gun, as was going on in South America at the time. Through them, the country was handed back to the oligarchy and foreign interests. As a result, inequality, which had improved markedly during Perón's first presidency, was back to pre-Peron levels by the 1970s. But by then at least, the Argentine cultural identity had solidified and it wasn't going anywhere. But still, the inferiority complex remained. It had just evolved from something socio-cultural into something much more economic. People started to believe that there was just something wrong with the Argentine economy and governments in general. Still though, among the upper classes, everything continued as normal. They still looked down upon their own culture and they wished so badly that they could be reborn in Europe or the USA.
¿Cómo ve al país? Es tan complicado, vivimos tan lejos de todo, ¿no? Yo veo allá qué fácil es esos muchachos que tienen unas vacaciones, pues toman un tren y se van a Venecia, o se van a Viena, o se van a Madrid, o de París, pero donde sea. Tan cerca, todo tan fácil. Acá vivimos tan lejos, ¿no? Y estamos tan a contramano, ¿no?
And they're still the same today, trust me. I've met plenty. Since the return to liberal democracy in 1983, there's been 3 elected presidents who've called themselves Peronists. The first, in 1989, was Carlos Menem. Menem gave fiery speeches and sounded pretty much exactly like Perón.
Pero hay uno que fue mi maestro, de quien me considero su discípulo, el 3 veces presidente de los argentinos, Teniente General Juan Domingo Perón.
Pretty much everyone thought that he was going to continue from right where Perón left off back in 1955, and that expectation was exactly what got him elected. But then he did pretty much the exact opposite. Neoliberalism, economic liberalization, free market capitalism, whatever you want to call it. Mass privatization, actions taken explicitly to benefit foreign capital, etc, etc. It's been called neoliberalism by surprise, which is definitely very apt. He was also probably more of a social conservative than Perón himself, even with 3.5 decades of changes to social norms between them. One of the clearest examples of this is that while Perón grappled with the church for control of the Catholic identity, Menem basically did everything he could to curry favor with the church. For example, he took little to no action on the AIDS crisis for a long time due to homophobia in the church, and he even tried to constitutionally ban abortion, which would have made it pretty much impossible to ever legalize. Oh, and he was also kind of weird.
Esas naves espaciales van a salir de la atmósfera, se van a remontar a la estratosfera y desde ahí elegir el lugar a donde quieran.
But despite the fact that pretty much everything that he was doing contradicted the original Peronism, he continued with the Peronist rhetoric, using it to justify his entirely different policies. And it kind of worked. He got re-elected in 1995 and retained lots of the Peronist vote. Menem ended his second and final constitutionally allowed consecutive term in 1999, leaving Argentina on a collision course with its worst ever economic crisis, as neoliberalism tends to do. The growing discontent with his economics was obvious in the fact that his party's candidate lost that year's election spectacularly. Menem came back and tried to regain the presidency in 2003, where he lost a Peronist versus Peronist contest against Nestor Kirchner, choosing to drop out rather than contest the second round after polls showed him losing very badly, and thus began the most recent Peronist strain to hold state power, Kirchnerism. The country was still feeling the effects of the neoliberal economic crisis of 2 years prior, which had left it with a huge debt to the International Monetary Fund, and it was quite ready to try something new after being dominated by free market fundamentalism and its associated collapses for many decades. Nestor refused to continue working with the IMF, instead negotiating the debt down and paying it all off within just a few years. He did a lot to reverse Menem's privatizations of essential services such as water. He adjusted Argentina's economic relationship with the US to be more measured and favorable to Argentina, in contrast to the subservience of Menem, though without returning to the outright hostility of Peron. As an alternative, he promoted stronger cooperation within Latin America itself. And he actually talked about inequality and implemented measures to try and remedy it, being the first post-dictatorship president to really do so.
Que asegure una mejor distribución del ingreso y muy especialmente que fortalezca nuestra clase media y que saque de la pobreza extrema a todos los compatriotas.
Another big move was his removal of immunity for dictatorship-era state terrorism, which had mostly been committed by members of the armed forces. He additionally brought the military under much tighter civilian control, two acts which made him quite unpopular with them. Remember, Peron was a military general himself, so this isn't quite what you'd expect from someone following his example. Nestor was also the first president to embrace sexual education and rights, something that takes a lot of guts in a country where 75% of the population is Catholic, and where the powerful Catholic Church is still state-funded and very politically influential. In 2007, he chose not to run for a second term. Rather, his First Lady, Cristina Fernández, also a prominent politician herself who had been a senator since 1995, ran with his support. She won the election decisively in the first round. After plans for Nestor and Cristina to alternate electoral runs were derailed by his unexpected death in 2010, Cristina was re-elected in another landslide in 2011. Her presidency continued along Nestor's lines, but was a bit less pragmatic and a lot more confrontational. She went after the propaganda arm of the business sector and traditional elite by passing ambitious reforms that restricted the concentration of media ownership. This brought her into a very public conflict with the conservative Clarion media empire that often dictates the country's political conversation, much to her own detriment. And in direct defiance of the church, she legalized marriage equality in 2010, allowed people to change their legal gender, expanded sex education, and made assisted reproduction much more accessible. A bit paradoxically, however, considering the rest of her record, she still remained opposed to legalized abortion. She did eventually come out in favor of it in 2018, after being out of office for 3 years, but that it took her so long definitely shows that her progressivism has some limits. Nonetheless, the Kirchners, and Cristina especially, are still definitely not social conservatives like Peron was. In fact, the opposition to Kirchnerism is much more like Peron in this respect than the Kirchners themselves, involving plenty of traditionalist Catholic conservatives. On the economic side of things, she went further than Nestor. She greatly expanded social welfare programs, the most notable instance being the Universal Allocation Per Child scheme, which, in contrast to Peron's privileging of formal workers, actually privileged informal workers, since it was a welfare payment only available to families who did not have a regular formal income. She also introduced subsidies for essential services, etc., and her policies quickly paid off, with the World Bank noting that the size of the middle class doubled during her presidency. As noted though, Kirchner's economics and social programs are still very different to those of Peron himself. Peron drew his support from formal, unionized workers and coerced informal workers into those sectors. In contrast, Cristina's project was much more inclusive. Economist Christopher Wilde writes, "Trade union groups form part of the alliance, although not as central a role as under formal models of capital accumulation such as Peronism. This is due to the fact that welfare provision has moved beyond formal, unionized sectors of society and into family life, thus reducing the influence of clientelistic links present between the state and the trade union movement present under Peronism. Peron also pretty much entirely rejected the so-called logic of the market. Wild, however, labels Kirchnerist economics post-neoliberalism, a reaction to the models of the past that is not the import-substitution industrialization of Peron, nor the out-and-out neoliberalism of someone like Menem, but rather something in between. He writes that it was characterized by the abandonment of economic protectionism in favor of at least relative economic opening and regional integration, and, albeit cautious and selective, welcoming of foreign direct investment. So, Kirchnerism accepts market principles while trying to manipulate them to the country's advantage when possible. So definitely not quite as much of a departure from Peron as Menem, but still very different. The Kirchnerist policies were highly focused on immediate improvements to material circumstances over macroeconomics. You can see this pretty clearly in the inflation levels when Cristina stepped down in 2015 after reaching the 2-term limit as president. Though, considering that the subsequent neoliberal policies of the current president, Mauricio Macri, have only served to make things much worse after 4 years in government, putting all of the blame on her for this would be more than a little bit dubious. So, where have we arrived with all of this? The question still remains, doesn't it? What is Peronism? Was Menem with his policies wholly antithetical to those of Peron a fake Peronist? Even though he seemed to truly believe that he himself was a Peronist and millions of Peronists voted for him twice? Is Kirchnerism, which is also a clear departure from the Peronism of Peron, also not Peronism? What about other Peronists? And there are far too many strains for me to mention in this video. Are the real Peronists to be found amongst them? Well, as I think the history of these three Peronist movements demonstrates pretty emphatically, we can't really say that any of them weren't real Peronists. They say they're Peronists, they talk like Peronists, they're supported by people who say they're Peronists as well, and everyone seems to be really earnest about the whole thing. Who are we to tell them that they're wrong? We simply have to move beyond actions, beyond policy, to find our answer. You might be thinking, well, why don't you just say it at the beginning and then we can skip all this history? Well, for one, because the history of Peronism is very interesting and I want it to be thorough. But far more importantly, because I had to show the huge differences between different Peronists, because there are many people who try to define it very simply and very narrowly by policy, while ignoring the very inconvenient differences that make such definitions completely untenable. Especially since many of the people who do so are the same smug elites or patronizing foreigners who think they know what's really best for Argentines. They absolutely love to simply define Peronism as when the government does stuff, which according to them is very bad. And they're always very certain that they're right, even when they can't pronounce the goddamn word.
What is Peronism? What is Peronism?
So where do we look next then? Well, it's simple actually. Rhetoric. Because where Peronists actually are similar is that they all tend to put out a very similar signal when they speak or when they campaign. It goes something like this, though usually far more long-winded and less on the nose. I reject the inferiority complex. I reject the paternalistic notion that we need the USA or Europe or the wisdom of the traditional oligarchy to show us the way.
Como decía Evita, le tengo más miedo al frío de los corazones de los compañeros que se olvidan de dónde vinieron que al de los oligarcas. Toda la vida lo he sentido así.
There is no reason that the people who live here should be marginalized in any way in favor of interests that merely want to profit from them.
Vengo a convocarlo para librar la batalla contra los privilegios, los intereses creados, la maraña inmensa de los especuladores, de los usureros, de los que buscan que nada cambie para que la miseria, el atraso, la pobreza y el hambre continúen en la República Argentina.
We have our own rich culture, our own ideas, our own thinkers. We have the resources, the knowledge, and the people. We are capable and we can work together and do this ourselves.
Un modelo argentino con crecimiento e inclusión a partir de la creación de trabajo digno. Un modelo en que el pueblo argentino resulte principal actor y beneficiario, sin copiar recetas enlatadas que pongan de pie nuestra capacidad de actuar colectivamente. Tiene que ser el norte de nuestra sociedad.
And those simple notions are something that make a lot of people really mad. Namely, elitist, self-hating Argentines and condescending foreigners. But it's also something that resonates with the vast majority, as the constant Peronist electoral landslides show. And it's quite clear why. It's a very positive message in a country where the most powerful non-Peronist politicians rarely offer much more than the negative, patronizing notion that imported ideas, culture, and capital are the only way forward. And this Peronist message also isn't even specifically a Peronist one. Rather, it's something universal throughout the colonial and post-colonial world. It's the same thesis put forth in every independence struggle, in every post-colonial liberation movement. From the Cuban Revolution to the South American pink tide of a decade ago. It's just that Peronists happen to have been the most prominent torch holder in Argentina. If it wasn't Juan Domingo Peron who had emerged at just the right time, it would have been others, and we'd be calling it some other type of ism. As to why Peronists differ so much in policy despite having a similar message, well, they might genuinely believe that their policies are the best or most practical way to deliver on their promises, even if they sometimes seem quite antithetical to it. It is possible to just be wrong, especially with the benefit of hindsight. They might also just be lying to win votes, which politicians kind of do all the time. In the end though, what really matters is not so much the Peronist politicians themselves. It's that while people may often end up very unsatisfied with them, they are very enthusiastic about the message. A political movement is not defined by its leaders who may have ulterior motives, who may lie, who may fail, but rather by the people who believe in their message and give them their legitimacy. And the simple, positive message of post-colonial liberation is one that's likely to remain popular here, whether it's being espoused by Peronists or others, until the day that Argentina finally reaches its lofty potential. I leave you with the words of Fernando Solanas, a filmmaker and politician born right here in Buenos Aires in 1936. A man who saw Peron's rise and fall, who lived through Peronism's prescription, who witnessed his return, who was forced into exile to avoid assassination during the last military dictatorship. Someone who has really seen it all, and whose work really emphasizes the positive side of the Peronist message that people like so much, and its universality.
Nuestra historia independiente nació de los hombres que afirmaban se puede, y lo demostraron junto al obstinado esfuerzo de su pueblo. Luego de décadas de oscuridad, renació desde el Caribe a la Patagonia la utopía de los pueblos originarios y la mayoría que han venido luchando por su emancipación. América Latina junta con todos los recursos y saberes, junto a sus originales patrimonios culturales. Es tiempo de retomar las ideales de Tupac Amaru, San Martín, Bolívar, Hidalgo, Artigas, Solano López, Martí, Zapata, Irigoyen, Sandino, Perón, Goulart, Allende, el Che, Fidel y los líderes del siglo XXI que retoman la bandera de la patria grande.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting my work on Patreon, which helps me afford to live and thus create more content. Thank you very much to all of my patrons, and especially the following: Leftist Tech Support, Inga Leonara, Daniel S., Kira B., Susie M., Tija, and Lord Hawkins. Thank you guys.